Gamergate 2, in a way, has kind of been a major failure right out of the gate, right? There's been no momentum behind it. There has been no, like, personality rise up. There has been no, like, boycott of the gaming industry. And in a lot of reasons, in a lot of ways, it didn't really need it to succeed because, like, Gamergate 1 already was such a huge thing. Right? Gamergate 1 was so successful, we didn't even have to win Gamergate 2. We didn't have to do anything, right? The grifters have risen up trying to exploit Gamergate the way they exploited Gamergate 1, and like basically all of them have just kind of fallen by the wayside, right? Yellow Flash, I'm sure Melody Mac, like I'm sure there's a lot of people that like have come forward, Boogie 2988. There's been a bunch of people I've seen like come out like in support of Gamergate 2, but the reality is like they're not really influencing anything, right? And good riddance, because that was the problem with Gamergate 1 fundamentally, is that too many people latched onto the movement to grift, to promote their own brands and like pull their own bullshit. Like when you look at the sector and what a nightmare that turned out into, yeah, that was because of Gamergate. That's where Ethan Ralph got his start. That's where Mundane Mac got his start. That's where Jim became relevant for the first time. Well, Jim was already slowly building up his career, but because of Jim's actions, right? His refusal to take any real responsibility for Gamergate, his refusal to really condemn any of the grifters for what they were doing, like his enabling for Ethan Ralph for years and years, like it spawned the sector who like discarded Gamergate the instant it stopped being like financially viable for them. And what happened? Destiny continued to be supported. Like the feminists kept doing their thing. Like nothing really changed. They just got worse. Okay. Like now I was completely unaffected by this because I was already like full on Nintendo exclusive by that point. So I was like completely unaffected by woke stuff like all throughout this period. But the reality of what happened with Gamergate was very clear to me, is that like everybody was simply grifting. Okay. Like there was no real conviction, there was no real passion. Like these guys didn't have like the knowledge or respect for video games to really dive deep into the real problem that like that the Sony PlayStation was a complete disaster and that it ruined video games, and the third party developers were colluding to ruin Nintendo. Like really, in a lot of ways, the declining quality of video games has nothing to do with woke culture at all, right? The reality is that like video games have been slowly getting worse since the 90s because the publishers realized they could just trick a demographic into supporting hardcore video games by pretending that their console, their brand was more mature and like had better graphics than their competition, right? So games like began getting more linear, they began getting repetitive, they had less and less content, less and less gameplay. The mechanics were less and less fleshed out. They weren't as good. There was like a very slow decline of it. Like back in the day, like there were a lot of apologists for that. Metal Gear Solid 2 is a really good example where the game is just objectively just a rehash of Metal Gear Solid 1, but like people would seriously try to tell you like, "Oh, that's the point. Oh, it's a meta narrative. Oh, it's postmodernist. Oh, it's so deep." Like people would downplay the real problems with Metal Gear Solid 2, with Final Fantasy 10, with the Sega Dreamcast era games, with like anything, in order to like push this narrative that like, oh, this is the real gaming, like it's just progress, bro, right? Like people promoted all kinds of like crazy stuff at the time, BioShock, Portal, The Last of Us, like all this just objectively terrible games, while like far superior stuff like Sin and Punishment Star Successor, or Banjo Tooie, DK64. Like how many times have you heard growing up that like DK64, meaning Donkey Kong 64, like killed the 2D, like the 3D collectathon platformer, right? How many times have you heard that? But in reality, if you come back to it today, you see the game is like insanely long, is insanely high quality, has 5 different playable characters, all these huge expansive worlds, gorgeous visuals, amazing animations that hold up even today. The game is still a top 3D platformer, right? It's still one of the best ever made. But like, did people acknowledge that? No. They were too busy like trying to convince you that GoldenEye wasn't good either. Like it is, the reality is, Gaming journalism has always been actively working to subvert video games. However, traditionally, what they were doing is that they were steering you away from the good video games, the stuff on Nintendo platforms, and tried to steer you towards PlayStation and Xbox, right? Try to steer you towards the mature third-party games. Now, the reason I bring this up is because like Gamergate 2 has had a really interesting phenomenon happen to it. Like I've been calling this out. I knew this was going to happen even before it did, by the way. Like so this didn't come out of nowhere. People have been trying desperately to get Nintendo involved in Gamergate too, right? You know, you're always seeing people that say things like, "Oh, even Nintendo is doing it," or "the Treehouse localizations are particularly bad," or "FE Engage is terrible." Like, "Oh, they're always censoring their games," but there's really no evidence for that at all, and it's just like a bunch of like hearsay from a bunch of people who are trying to fabricate a narrative, right? These people, like the censor shitters, I call them, like they really want you to believe that Nintendo of America is actively censoring games from Japan, right? Instead of like it being a partnership where like Nintendo has an oversight over them and like tells them what they can and can't do. Like Nintendo of America does not have the amount of control that people think it does, but that has been the narrative for a long time, right? Nintendo of America is the most woke company of them all. If you like pay attention to these people, like, oh, they completely ruined Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom. Like they're trying to tell you, right? They're trying to tell you that like Nintendo is doing all these terrible things with their localizations, when in reality it's not true at all, or it's greatly exaggerated. Like, they have a name for an item in Japanese, and it's called something different in English, which is perfectly normal and is an acceptable localization, right? So like they're sitting here trying to convince you that like Nintendo is censoring these products. Like they're the worst of them all. Like meanwhile, the Discocheck controversy with Jello Apocalypse has gone completely ignored. Right. In that situation, I think is a lot more indicative of like what woke censoring of Japanese media typically looks like, where you have like a contractor with an agenda come in and do as much as they possibly can before getting like unceremoniously kicked from the project, right? Like that's kind of what that is kind of what I think is happening with Nintendo right now, where like they do have woke people there, plenty of woke people actually, but they don't actually have the ability to do the things that people are saying they're doing. And the issue with complaining about those people specifically is that like there are so many others that you should be talking about first, right? Why, for example, has Gamergate 2 not been talking about Neil Druckmann? Why have they not been talking about how he kickstarted like this trend in games where Gamjonos think they can like proclaim certain personalities to be like Western gaming auteurs, right? Like how many people have like addressed the issues with The Last of Us, right? The narrative pretty consistently since The Last of Us Part 2 came out was that like, oh no, the game is good. It's just the story that's the problem. But the reality is that like that's not really the case. Like The Last of Us was always terrible. It was always bad, and nobody was willing to admit it until like The Last of Us Part 2 like was leaked, right? Like I've said this before, but like if I believe that if The Last of Us Part 2 was not leaked, like there would have been a much more polarized reaction to The Last of Us Part 2. It would not be universally disliked the way it is now. Like people would have been damage controlling it for a long time. And then they would have tried to tell you that like, oh, people are just complaining for the sake of complaining, whatever. Like, no. But again, like this is exactly my point. Like, why are you complaining about Nintendo when you could be complaining about Spider-Man 2? Like, they're legit telling you that they're gonna have Miles Morales in the next game, right? They're telling you that he's gonna be the main Spider-Man going forward. Never mind that Miles Morales will never be Spider-Man to begin with, but like, what's he gonna do? Like, turn into a Super Saiyan next? Is he gonna be the Human Torch? Like, I don't know who Miles Morales is, but he seems to be like a compilation of every single fictional character in existence. Like, I've seen him be a Super Saiyan. I've seen him be the Human Torch. Like, again, like, what does this have to do with Spider-Man? Like, and do people talk about that, or is that like a major discussion point? No. Like all people are doing now are trying to steer the discussion towards Nintendo. Like purely for grifting purposes. And that needs to be addressed. I've seen Yellow Flash do it, I've seen Grums do it. These people need to be told that this is not acceptable. You have to wait until Nintendo actually does something before you try to criticize them for it.